Welcome back to another episode of Consciously Clueless. I'm your host, Carly, and I will be your guide on the journey from cluelessness to consciousness and back around again. I'm really excited to be back here with you all for a short solo episode, whether you're listening to this on Sunday to kind of ground down for the week, or maybe some Monday motivation in the morning, or whatever day you're listening to this. I'm really glad you're here. So if you follow me on Instagram, you might have seen my post about injuring my foot due to running. And after I started thinking about it this weekend, I realized how this injury kind of served as a metaphor for life. Now let me take you back, if that doesn't make sense. A few months ago, I was dealing with my depression, and it was really hard for me to physically move my body. So I didn't run all that much for a couple of months. And then once I started to get that spark a little bit, I was like, I'm ready to run. And I wanted to go immediately, right away, from 0 to 60. Not only that, but I started planning a race that would serve as a fundraiser for some local organizations in my town. And one of the races in that fundraiser was a half marathon. So obviously I needed to run a half marathon. So going from no running for a few months to not only starting to run, but training for a half marathon. And training, you can imagine, in air quotes. So I started to run, and it felt really good to move my body again. But then I definitely started to push it a little bit too hard. And by a little bit, I mean a lot. I increased my distance pretty fast. I wasn't listening to my body. I also had embarrassingly old shoes. I mean, any of my friends right now that are listening are shaking their head because of their disappointment in these shoes. It's ridiculous. So not only was I not taking care of my equipment, which I know better, I was not taking care of my body, which I also know better. But I thought I could get through it. I've gotten through it before. I can skate by. So I just kept going against my better judgment. Kept running, kept increasing my distance, kept working on my pace. And while I was running one day, all of a sudden I had a shooting pain from my foot to my ankle. And being the stubborn person I am, I kept running, thinking it was just a little kink that would work itself out. Now that I say that out loud, I realize how ridiculous that is. But I kept running, and finally I had to turn around because of how bad it got, which is really something for me, so you know it was bad. And I thought maybe if I just stayed off it for the rest of the day, it would go away. I just must have tweaked it. But it felt bad the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and it was not going away. It was getting a little better because I was staying off of it, but it hurt to flex my foot. It hurt to walk. It was just ridiculous. And me not being mobile, especially after struggling to be mobile for a while, felt like it was going to be really hard. I was more worried about my mental health than I was actually running at this point. So I paused for a little bit. I held off, let my foot heal. That took a few weeks, and I have been so antsy. Y'all, it is killing me to not be able to just get up and run whenever I want. I really, really have been struggling with that. And I was reflecting on it recently when I finally got it looked at and was told that it was tendinitis, and was told the reasons why it happened, the ones I already listed: bad shoes, too much, too fast. And I realized that I definitely knew that I was doing some things wrong. I definitely knew I wasn't listening to my body. I definitely knew I was pushing too hard, too fast. But I'd gotten away with it in the past, and I thought, I'll get away with it this time too. Except this time, the universe was like, you've hit your limit with this silliness. You're done. Literally, you have to sit down. And while I was thinking about it, it hit me today how similar that is to the patterns overall in life that we get into. So hear me out. I know that we all have different patterns that only exist because we haven't done anything with them. Patterns that harm ourselves, patterns that harm our partners, patterns that harm our friendships. Just, we're all come with our own baggage. We all have our own shit. It's not a bad thing, it's reality. But patterns only work for so long until they need to be reconfigured. Just like my pattern of pushing too hard with my workouts and not listening to when my limit was reached. So whether it's you're conflict avoidant or you have a bad pattern because you feel abandoned from your childhood, whatever it is, we all have these patterns, big or small, that affect how we operate in the world. Maybe it's a pattern on how we handle when our body doesn't look the way we want it to. Is it a pattern of negative self-talk? Whatever it is, we all have patterns that we can work on. And that might sound kind of scary to start thinking about, but I want to reframe it and think about it as an exciting thing to discover. Because identifying the pattern is half the battle. You're naming it. You're making it a thing. And once you name it, you'll probably see it show up again. Sometimes when you don't want it to, like if you're having an argument with your partner and you're like, shit, this is that pattern I haven't dealt with. But my point is, these patterns are only sustainable for so long. Sometimes you have to deal with them because you literally have exhausted all other options. Or you've pushed too hard that you have physical pain in your foot, like my example here. But whatever it is, you can start to figure out what those clues are that maybe you're stepping back into an old pattern. And then you can start to try and fix it. That should be exciting because that's the work that we have to do whether we want to or not. So to be able to identify it, like now I can remember and say, this is what happened last time I didn't listen to these clues. I physically couldn't run for weeks. Remember how shitty that was? And then I can change my actions to suit a better outcome. I can't believe it took me 28 years to realize that I should listen to my body with running, but here I am. But it sometimes takes a lot longer to think of some of these patterns. We get comfortable in our reactions. We get comfortable in our ways of dealing with things. We get comfortable in running away from our problems because sometimes our patterns exist because they make things easier. It was easier to run than it was to think about being injured. It's easier to run away from our trauma of our past than it is to dig in and figure out what it's going to mean to deal with for the rest of our life. Whatever it is, sometimes those patterns are helpful. They get us through moments, but they are not sustainable. And we all deserve the time and space to deal with them and to move through them because then they become so much easier. I know my example is silly, but it's real. Like I feel empowered now that I had to kind of hit this place where I couldn't think about anything else but my injury to realize that moving forward, I'm going to take it so much more seriously for the rest of my life. And whether it's something physical, like the example I keep coming back to, or something relational or mental or body image related, whatever it is, once it clicks and you start to see the pattern and recognize it and move through it, it becomes so much easier. And it's counterintuitive because this pattern exists to get us through shit we don't want to deal with. So to think about dealing with it and becoming easier sounds like I'm lying to you, but I swear I'm not. It might not be easier right away. That I will be truthful about. But in the long run, it's going to be easier and easier on your body. Whether that's your mind, your body, your soul, whatever it is, in the long run, it's so worth it. I mean, for another example, I avoided dealing with my mental health stuff for so long because I was scared to name it, one, and two, I was scared what that process would look like. It's scary. To say, oh, I think I've been dealing with depression for longer than I've been talking about means you have to examine why. And you have to examine where it came from or why it gets triggered or all of these other things. But now that I'm diving into it, now that I talk to someone, now that I'm becoming more and more open to talking about it in general, it feels like a weight is lifted off of my chest because it is just something I can talk about and share about. And that is so freeing. I broke the pattern of not wanting to deal with it. I broke the pattern of feeling shameful about it. That was a huge piece. I think there's a lot of that in this world of health and wellness when everyone is posting online about the perfect workout or the perfect mindset. And I love talking about that stuff too. But sometimes those people feel pressure to not talk really openly about the struggles because it can be scary to open up about that stuff when you're trying to build a brand or start a business. But for me, the more I do that, the more I connect with all of you. And it has been the most beautiful thing I've experienced. To have people reach out and have similar experiences, to say, I totally understand, or that makes sense. I hadn't heard from you for a while. Or in terms of running, to have a friend say, yeah, I told you you needed new shoes. Like whatever it is, it's made me connect and talk to people. And that helps get us out of our pattern too. When we tell other people about it, like, look, this is what was making me feel this way or act this way, and I'm trying to work through it. Give yourself some grace. At first, I was so mad at myself for this injury, especially when I had to confront the idea that a lot of it was a shitty pair of shoes. I was just avoiding getting the next pair. I mean, how embarrassing. But it's just a part of it. It was a part of me not wanting to deal with it. It was a part of me being stubborn. It was a part of me thinking, I'm healthy enough, I'm fine. It's worked before. And like I said, the universe basically laughed in my face and said, absolutely not. And here I am with a brand new pair of running shoes as of today. I cannot even tell you how excited I am to say that. And I am going to slowly integrate some changes into my routine to make it a more sustainable journey to a half marathon at a much more doable pace. And that is how to deal with the other patterns in your life too. It doesn't mean when you recognize that there's something you've been doing in your relationships or your friendships or your life that's harmful, it doesn't mean you're going to change it overnight. It doesn't mean that once you see it, you have to know exactly how to deal with it. It doesn't mean that you still might not try to avoid it. But you can slowly integrate change. You can slowly try to figure out what would make it easier to deal with this pattern that you've created in your life, or this pattern that came out of something you experienced in your life. Whatever it is, you deserve to figure it out. You deserve to get to the other side of that. You're not stuck. Just because you're in a pattern doesn't mean that pattern is forever. Unless you make it forever, you're in control of that. I could have kept running on my foot. I could have injured myself more. I could have ignored it. I could have made it better and then not dealt with it again. I could have pushed through depression and just hoped to get to the other side and then not talk about it. And when it flares up again, try and do the same thing like I have. But those patterns weren't working for me anymore. It's like a shedding of a skin. You just get to the point where you have to leave that behind. And you get to choose. I love this analogy. I heard this on another podcast about therapy and thinking about a car. So if you drive a car and you hear a funny noise or you realize something feels a little funny, you'll probably take it in. And you're going to take it in, hopefully before you're driving and the car starts on fire or explodes in the middle of the road. That's kind of like these patterns or our mental health or our physical health. take it in when you start to hear the funny noise or when something feels off. Because otherwise you have to get to the bottom, and sometimes that's how people operate too. I've gone through that. Sometimes you have to feel like there are no other options. But once we start to recognize this stuff and get good at it and practice, then we start to notice things before you have to get to that point. I feel more knowledgeable about the mechanics of my foot now, where if I start to feel something a little off, I'll know what I'm feeling. And I'll hopefully, fingers crossed, take care of it a little sooner. So if you know about a pattern in your life, what are you going to do to move through that pattern? What can you do? What can you start with tonight or this morning, whenever you're listening to this, right now? What can you start to think about? Maybe it's just naming it. And let me tell you, if anyone out there is thinking, I don't think I have any patterns that are damaging, you just haven't discovered yet. We are humans. We are not perfect. We all have these things. Some are big, some are small, some come later in life, some have been with us forever. It's okay. It's okay. You are still a lovely, worthy, whole, complete person with just a few sounds to take the car in for an engine check. Do it when you feel like you can. I am so thankful for all of you. I'm so thankful for this space to share these crazy thoughts that pop into my head. I'm so excited to keep learning and growing together. Maybe we'll discover some more patterns together, try and figure our shit out. Because when we work on ourselves, we're working on the world, because we're all connected, guys. I know that's corny, but it's true. When you work on yourself, you're making the world a better place, which is pretty cool when you think about it. So keep doing the work, recognize those patterns, and if you need new running shoes, please get new running shoes. That is the biggest takeaway you can take from this podcast. Don't ignore the pains in your feet. I hope you enjoyed this little mini Sunday episode. I really am loving recording these. If you have enjoyed listening to this podcast so far, I would so appreciate if you went to Apple Podcasts and left a review. That is how more people will see this podcast, if it gets more and more reviews. So if you enjoy it, please hop over there and then send this to a friend that you think would enjoy it. I will see you in the next episode.